This video has been percolating in my spirit for 3 years now, and we've been waiting for a day where I had enough spoons to film it and to brace myself for the onslaught of John 3:16 references in the comments and attempts to reconvert me or tell me that I was never really a Christian. I don't know, who even knows. But here we are. I've decided we're gonna just do this. It was recently Easter, and I forgot that it was even coming until people reminded me, and I was like, whoa, that is a huge, talk about 180 from where I at some point was in my life. As well as I recently did a very hilarious live show. One of my favorite things I've done on BookTube was some friends of mine talking about the book Corinne, which is a lot about religion, and we were talking about shared religious histories. So anyway, here we are. Today we're gonna do this. And what we're gonna do is two things. One, we're gonna talk about, I'm gonna make a little commentary video reflecting on how I think my background in fundamentalist evangelicalism has shaped me as a person to who I am today. And, you know, our self-insight and reflections on what does what in our personalities and sense of self, etc. I mean, it's a whole ball of yarn that no one can fully unravel, but this is me, you know, kind of reflecting on that. And then the other thing that I get asked a lot is books for people who are deconstructing or reconstructing. We'll get into it. But we're gonna have a whole book section that's basically like
my journey into doubt.
where I've landed today. So anyway, before we get into either of those, I should give some context, which is I come from a fundamentalist evangelical tradition. Now, what does that mean? It means that, well, a book we're going to talk about is Fundamentalism in American Culture. Fundamentalism was a specific, is a specific religious movement within evangelicalism that is quite separatist from the world at large. Whereas evangelicalism is really a religious movement that is syncretic and arising out of the Enlightenment era in European and European colonized countries. So fundamentalism is a sect within evangelicalism, but it became so dominant, really starting in the 80s, but certainly up through today, in terms of influencing evangelical culture writ large, that most evangelicals at this point, at least in the US, and I should say all of this, I'm mostly talking about a US context because that's my context, would be considered fundamentalist evangelicals. Not because they necessarily strictly adhere to what would be described as key tenets of fundamentalism, but because their culture has been so influenced by fundamentalism. But evangelicalism is it definitely starts as Protestantism. There are definitely evangelical Catholics. It's kind of a, let's call it a flavor of Christianity, shall we? That is, I would say, the dominant mode. Context here, I do have a master's in theological studies. I taught church history, so I'm gonna be very tempted to get into a lot of details and nuances throughout this. I'm gonna do my best to hold myself back because I'm trying to speak in generalities, and if you wanna nerd out about theology or church history in the comments, I welcome that. I love that, but I'm gonna try to keep it general. So taking a step back, I'm gonna argue in this that evangelicalism has been the dominant mode of American Christianity pretty much since the beginning. The Puritans were not evangelical per se, but are definitely considered to be a part of a proto-evangelical movement. And evangelicalism in America really takes root in the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, etc. It has been the dominant mode of Christianity in terms of religious fervor or adherence in the US for most of its history. So American evangelicalism is a very pervasive cultural and political force here in the US, and because it has been so focused on missionary work, it has also exported its sort of sensibilities to a lot of other countries around the world. American colonialism, at it again. Anyway, so that is definitely the tradition that I converted under and grew up in to some extent. I will say that I'm a unique use case because my parents actually were taking me to a quite progressive, mainline Presbyterian church throughout my youth, which is an unusual experience for a fundy evangelical in the South. I mean, we're talking there was a woman preacher. We're talking that there were gay elders. It was a whole vibe. So I'm unusual in the sense that on Sunday I was getting a very different flavor of Christianity than I was getting during the week, because the context in which I converted to Christianity was a fundamentalist evangelical school. 1 through 12. To like place this, we had Pat Buchanan come multiple times to give rallies. We had chapel with like anti-evolution singers. And we'd have chapels where there was a cross where we had to all go like nail up our deep dark secrets on there. It was a whole, like, it was the full experience. So that's the context that I'm coming from and speaking from in terms of how it influenced me. Yeah, I'm gonna try to talk about like the things I think are good and bad in the context of this. And we'll just see where we get to. A little listeroo here of 4 main areas that I feel like evangelicalism impacted my life. So first is influencing me to want to be good. This idea of being good as being one of the most important things one can be. I think that there's some really good aspects of that. Good, that feels weird to say being good is good. A little tautological there, but you know, let's just roll with it. I think that there are some positive things about inculcating in a child, or an adult for that matter, a deep longing to be good. Yeah, I think most parents don't want to raise bad people, or people who don't care about other people, or people who are not trying to kind of get along in life. So I don't want to downplay that. I do have a very profound sense of wanting to be a virtuous person even to this day. So I think that there are some definite positives to that. The negatives, however, is that the emphasis on being good, I think, is very contingent on how one defines good. And there are some things about the way evangelicalism defines goodness that I would co-sign in terms of humility, or having grace to other people, or wanting to be forgiving of other people, at least in theory. All of these are in theory. Being self-sacrificial, you know, I think can be seen as a good. The struggle is that some of the ways that evangelicalism defines goodness, I have a lot of questions about as an adult. So I think one of the best examples is stuff around purity culture and how closely a very specific set of sins, and even just the concept of sin, gets really drilled into evangelical youth, that these are sort of the marks by which you are judged to be good or bad. And if you are not complying or meeting those standards, you're not good, you're bad. And that is a really damaging message to be drilling into a child's head, especially as a fat child. One of the things for women that was very drilled into me was that being thin was good. Now, I want to be clear that it's very difficult for me to unravel the different strands of hating my body that was given to me from family and culture and whatever. So like, not saying this is all evangelicalism, but I will say one of my friends went back and did like some work in the school that we went to, and in her research she found that 80% of the girls had eating disorders. I think that there is a very specific aesthetic goodness that is ascribed to in evangelicalism, at least for a woman. It is thin and white and put together, modest, but still alluring. It's a lot of contradictions of what it means to be good from an aesthetic perspective. So there's that. And then also, just as I was mentioning purity culture, that is one of the sins that is really drilled into evangelical youth, which is you have sex, you will get pregnant and die, much like the coach in Mean Girls says. It's very shame-based purity culture. I mean, my wellness, like gym class kind of thing, I would say a smooth 60% of it was purely around some version of sex ed. I've had every metaphor for purity given to me, from, you know, a tainted brownie to a rose that has no petals left, to chewed up gum, to Velcro that's not sticky anymore, to one day we did this thing where they had like some sort of reagent in one of these cups to represent STDs, and then they would have us like pour it so that by the end of it we all had STDs. Also, anti-abortion rhetoric is very drilled into this, because if you do have sex and you do get pregnant, you are expected to keep it. but the culture and attitudes around that topic are so shame-based that many Christian girls do get abortions and then feel shitty about it and then go on to pass that judgment on to other people. Like, it's a whole cycle of shame within the purity culture of evangelicalism, and I know other religious movements as well. I've definitely heard from like ex-Mormons that that's a big thing. So all that to say, I think goodness, the idea of wanting to be good, is a positive thing, but you've got to be really careful how you define goodness. And I would say a lot of the measures by which I would have said someone was good as an evangelical are very different than what I would say goodness is now. Goodness to me is about empathy and kindness towards others, genuine love for your fellow man that is not rooted in performance or obligation, but just a shared sense of humanity, wanting to mitigate and relieve suffering where possible, things like that. Next thing I put on my list is I think it played into my potentially innate sense of really wanting to be right. One of the very reassuring things about evangelicalism is this lack of doubt and lack of uncertainty. Depending on the flavor of Christianity you're in under evangelicalism, if you're like a predestination kind of girly or more like a free will kind of girly pop, you're gonna have a different sense of like how sure you can be about your salvation. But overall, I would say that there is a strong emphasis that you are on the right path and a reassurance that your way of looking at the world is the only right way. That everyone else is on a bad path, a path that will lead them to hell, and you are on the right path, that the church, and however that gets defined, because part of evangelicalism is a very dispersed ecclesiology that is very hard to define, the true church. That's why there's a million little sects and nobody can get along, etc. But the church is right. Everyone else is wrong. Now, I suspect that this is just a part of my personality because I'm a very strong type 1. I'm an ENFJ. The J is very strong with me. I'm a Virgo moon, all those things. The other thing is that I am pretty smart, so I do tend to be right about a lot of things, which only feeds into this problem. I have to really check myself. But I really like to be right, and I often am right. And it definitely facilitates a level of judgment that I've spent a lot of time tamping down. Now, some level of judgment is natural and good. You have to have some kind of judgment about what you think you should do in certain situations. I think this idea that no judgment or being completely unjudgmental is a virtue, I don't think is quite right. And I should say that also, like, if you have any kind of belief that is even mediumly held or an opinion, you think you're right about it. I wouldn't hold an opinion if I thought I was wrong about it, but I was just holding to it anyway. And I mean, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from ethicists amongst us how it can hold different kinds of beliefs and be there some sort of like hyper good above one's personal opinion that you hold. I don't know. Anyway, I think for the most part, if you have an opinion, it's because you think you're right. So I'm not trying to say that thinking that you're right or being right is necessarily bad. The thing I have had to counteract as an adult is being really certain that you're right and not really allowing any kind of doubt to enter the equation and not allowing new information to change your perspective. Now, it's interesting because I think because I'm a very confident communicator, I think often people think that I'm more strong in my opinion than I am. So even my dad, when he was alive, he made some sort of comment to me about something to the effect of like not changing my mind. And I'm like I have radically changed my mind about several major life topics in the course of you knowing me. And I've changed even more since then. So like, I am clearly able to change my mind. But I think that was something I definitely learned and was very humbled by in the deconstruction process out of evangelicalism, is having a lot more of a check in my mind about assuming that I'm right about something. And also being a lot more open to different perspectives and much less black and white thinking, much more gray, and acknowledging that people can be right about one thing and wrong about another. Just because I think somebody is right about one thing doesn't make them good about everything, or that I have to agree with them on everything. That's something that I've really had to root out because I was so raised to just like trust that so-and-so is an authority and you do what they say, or you take their word for it, or this is what the Bible says, so that's the right thing. And I think through the process of deconstruction and being able to be a much more analytical reader of that text and a much more literate purveyor of church history and theological history, I think that I've really had a lot of humbling, that I thought I was really right about a lot of things that I was not. So again, I think the good part of it is wanting to seek out being right and wanting to do the right thing. I think that's a really positive trait, something I'm glad that maybe it helped cultivate in me. But I think the negative side is being overly confident that I'm right and overly judgmental of people who I don't think are right. Those are things I've really had to work a lot on in myself. And actually, we all have a long way to go, but I'm really proud of that work, that inner work I have done as an adult to be somebody who can have really strong opinions, but not use that as a way to think other people are going to hell, whatever this like non-religious version of that is. And that's something I hope I'm getting better at every year, of balancing having a strong sense of right and wrong and having openness to new facts, new perspectives, new ideas, like holding those two things in tension and trying to always see the other side and really take that side into consideration. I think I will always be working on that, but that is work that I did in my 20s that I'm very proud of. Then I will say this is one that I have mostly positive things to say about. I think that one thing, religious teachings in youth and young people, one really good thing about it is it does teach you to think abstractly. So because you are taught prayer in evangelicalism, which you could think of as a form of meditation, you're taught to think about like big philosophical ideas like the problem of suffering, or what is good, what is bad, epistemology, ontology. They may not be labeled as such, but you're being indoctrinated into some pretty heavy philosophical presuppositions pretty early, and taught how to map a religious text to those ideas, and having an entire relationship with a being that you can't see, and like you think that you're in touch with spiritual I don't know. I think that it's not really a bad thing that children are introduced to abstract thinking early on and taught to take that seriously. And even metaphysical stuff. Like, I know that there are some people who leave religion and feel like it's really, really damaging to kids, and like, hey, I hear ya, and I think a lot of flavors of evangelicalism on the whole are more damaging to kids than not. But I don't think that religion, ontologically, if you will, is a bad thing. Like, I think that it is it can be a very mind-expanding way to look at the world, and I think teaching kids to think about things beyond just the materiality of what they can see and can't see is not a bad thing. And I think especially if it's taught with less certainty and more openness can be like actually kind of a really positive thing. I would say that one of the things that I get from evangelicalism, and especially once I, was getting my master's and stuff, like I have a real love for philosophy and, trying to think about the way systems work or think about the nature of reality, all of that. I don't know, like I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. I think that that's been very personally, like I find it interesting, but also I think it's made me a better person as a whole to think about those things. And then the fourth thing I put was this idea of really, I think evangelicalism really situates people as that they are a prime actor in a big story. I think a lot of progressive or attempts at progressive evangelicalism are very rooted in story. I think I'm not even going to get into all the reasons why I think that is. It makes sense to me in terms of the problems that they're having. And if you want to stay evangelical in some way, like why that is an appealing route, it does make a lot of sense. Anyway, I think this idea of you are a main character in an adventure that God has set for you. I think that can give a lot of purpose to life. And I think in some contexts that can be a really helpful way of looking at your life. There's a lot of, especially in the face of like big problems that the world is facing. I mean, climate change and inflation and discrimination and macro level forces in life. And I think being able to picture yourself or situate your place within those macro forces as an agent for change and for good can be a really positive thing. I think it helps me, I would say that I vote so that, I have the right to complain. If you don't vote, you don't get to complain. And I like complaining. But, a lot of people don't vote because they think of it very, like one vote doesn't count kind of thing, which any one vote doesn't, at least here in the US in some way. But if you're kind of trained to think of yourself as like, this is my part of the story and like, I'm gonna do my thing. Like, I think that can be a really positive framing for participating in social change or in any kind of like political macro level change. I think having that kind of mindset can be a really positive thing. I think it also gives you some personal accountability, or I'm not sure sure what the right word I want to use there is, but I think it does make you feel like what you do matters in a way, not having that kind of framing inculcated in you. I don't know. I mean, I can't really get into the counterfactual, but I guess I can say that evangelicalism has made me somebody who thinks of myself as, even if me doing this one bit of recycling isn't going to stop climate change, like I'm the kind of person who recycles. Do you know what I mean? Like it makes me think of myself as a cog or like as a player in a bigger story or in a bigger picture. I think the negative side of that is that, at least in most evangelicalism, I've encountered a lot of times that big picture is really this like battle between heaven and hell, and this whole framing of hell, which I think is a really destructive concept and really sets you up to make a lot of choices for yourself and have a lot of judgments of others that is really negative. I also think that it can overemphasize a sense of personal responsibility or personal autonomy that doesn't have enough of a realistic sense of our scale in life, that we don't have as much free will in terms of the choices that we can and can't make, in terms of how much we are actually able to effectuate change in our lives or in the lives around us. And I think that that rallying point, I think because there's a certain sense of sort of like solidarity to that story, it causes people to be very destructive in terms of like having a lot of gumption to be loud about things. It's kind of, it can be good or bad. It can be an organizing and unifying factor towards trying to move a story in a certain direction that is in a positive way, or it can be, it can make you sort of a crusader, I guess, an ironic term in the scheme of Christianity. It can give you, I think, sort of like a hero complex or like savior complex. I think it can go in a negative direction for sure, which I definitely see playing out in some of the culture war stuff here in the US that is driven by a lot of evangelicals. I think that some of that comes from this idea of like, we can't let these drag queens read to children because then it's one step further on the path to hell. I think it can give you kind of a grandiosity about the stakes of things that you are advocating for. And also I think it can make you a little self-important on certain areas that are kind of like none of your business. So, okay. So hopefully that was a different kind of reflection on evangelicalism. I don't know. I could do like another video, or I guess I could have done a video about why I'm not an evangelical anymore, why I'm not a Christian anymore, or whatever. I don't know how interesting or helpful that is to anyone besides me. So that's my attempt at making this more commentary. Now on to the books. I'm sure I'm leaving a ton off of this, but I'm trying to organize these as the journey that I went on. So just imagine before this, I was, reading a lot of like toxic John Piper stuff, or Beth Moore, who I, surprisingly would stand behind, especially the journey she's been on. I love this for her. But I was not like a Rachel Held Evans girly, R.I.P. She was not like a big person in my deconstruction journey, though I know she is for some people. I was not like a Brian McLaren person. I don't know. I feel like I didn't hit some of the typical folks, but I did hit some of them, and we're just gonna go in order. So some of the ones that started to like open my mind up a little bit, and I will say the other reason I've been hesitant to give a list is that I don't want people who are super, like, I'm thinking about myself back in this era, and if I had known that these books might lead me away from some of these thoughts, I might not have read them. So that's the other hesitancy I've had, but I guess I'm just gonna have to take that risk, and I'll tell you what some of them are. Some of the big bad scary books that made me think critically. Gasp horror. Okay, some of the ones that were like, I think, key to opening up that door, just the door was cracked open just enough for me to start stepping through something a little bit more, thinking about things for myself instead of just like trying to be indoctrinated by what other people were saying the Bible said. The Divine Conspiracy, Rediscovering Our Hidden Life in God by Dallas Willard. In general, Dallas Willard, I feel like was a pretty positive influence. To give you a sense of where I was, I remember I went to like a weekend lecture conference thingy he was doing and thinking,
he has too much emphasis on love and how we're supposed to love everyone.
That's where I was in my evangelical journey. Okay, so anyway, he started me thinking about some of that stuff and a little bit more of a different lens of like, I know that he's a Christian, but he's saying that like, love conquers all. What are we doing here? What about the truth and righteousness and justice and all of that of God? Who knows? When Life and Beliefs Collide by Carolyn Custis James How Knowing God Makes a Difference. This book is like a call to women being theologically literate, and it made me open to actually reading real theology instead of just sort of like more packaged devotional kind of theology. I think that this opened me up to that as a concept. And then Henry Nouwen's Life of the Beloved, Spiritual Living in a Secular World. I think just the fact that he's Catholic was something new of like reading from a Catholic. Oh my God. Side note, there are evangelical Catholics out there. I get that now. At the time, not so much. But anyway, this is a much more like spiritual theology than I think I was used to, in terms of less prescriptive about here is how you pray, and more like inviting you to explore something. This felt a little less prescriptive and a little bit more exploratory, which is why I think it was a mind opener for me. Okay, and then I'm gonna talk about the 4 books that I think like most impacted me when I first got into grad school. And I want to emphasize that this grad school was by all standards orthodox, as I would have considered it at the time, at least its official position. Some of the people there were not as orthodox as I would have, if I had understood just how radical they were. I don't know how I would have felt about it, but at least the positions of the school were very evangelical, very orthodox, orthopraxis. The positions they held were up to my very evangelical standards. So this was not me going to like Harvard Divinity School, where of course I'm going to get all kinds of like heterodox nonsense. This was very orthodox, very Bible believing, inviting Jesus into your heart, the whole shebang. So the first book that I read, or like chunk of book that I read there that blew my mind, because it's the book that made me realize that I did not understand church history. It's actually The Missionary Movement in Christian History, the introduction from Andrew Walls on this. It's not like, this is the one that made me realize, because his whole thing is, if you plopped an alien down in 1st century Jerusalem Christianity versus 6th century Irish Christianity versus 9th century Greek Christianity, like all of these different versions of Christianity would still call themselves Christians, and yet they would be so different. And there was something about the way he framed that it was the first time that it really, like, I think this gave me my sense of history in the church. We would always talk about like the Acts church, and realizing that the way they did Christianity and the way I did Christianity would be very different, even though we were always talking about like getting back to the book of Acts. Maybe it was dumb of me to have never thought about it that way, but I didn't. And so he's actually talking about this, the indigenizing movements of Christianity, and how Christianity has adapted itself to a wide variety of cultures over time and place, which I think is true, and I would not co-sign a lot of what he probably thinks about missionary movements at this point in my life, In the moment, this was very mind-opening. This book is kind of similar, Jesus Through the Centuries, His Place in the History of Culture, talking about how people have thought about Jesus in different ways over time, and what I would have considered to be like true Christians, and how they could all have such different views of Jesus, was also very mind-opening. I think that this is a really good, small, approachable version of Christian church history, if that's what you're looking for. Yeah, I really liked the writing in this one, though I know not everybody does. I think that this was opening my eyes to the idea that there could be different kinds of emphases placed on different syllables of the story and person of Jesus. Ooh, this was a hefty one. I read this over a Christmas break, and this broke my mind. N.T. Wright, The New Testament and the People of God. This is talking about the historical and literary contexts of the New Testament. This really just made me look at and think about the New Testament in a totally different way. I'm not ever going to do this, but I would be interested to go back and read this now, because at the time it was just like, and now I think I would find it very tame and like quite orthodox. But at the time, the way this, okay, my camera overheated. I don't know where I was, but I think I was just telling you that if I were to read N.T. Wright today, my guess is I would find it much tamer than I found it at the time. And then the other like real change in perspective for me was Believing Again, Doubt and Faith in a Secular Age by Roger Lundeen. This was where I really came to believe or confront, or however you want to put that, the idea that the opposite of faith is not doubt, the opposite of faith is certainty. And this is talking about how doubt and faith coexist and kind of have to coexist in an age of modernity where a lot of the sort of God of the gaps elements of God are dissolved. And so like what is left? This is talking about that in the context of literature. But yeah, this was a very paradigm impactful one for me. And then I've got like a stack of theology things and a stack of history things. The history one is shorter, so maybe let's go there. Fundamentalism and American culture. Like everything around fundamentalism that I studied really helped me understand my own tradition that I came out of, and like where certain beliefs or certain shibboleths or certain like a priori assumptions came from. This is sort of the seminal work, and I was lucky enough to actually take a seminar with George Marsden, and the thing that I think I found most illuminating is his idea. What he was talking about is the idea, what I was explaining at the beginning of this idea that fundamentalism has really shaped evangelicalism since the 80s, and he would argue, or like he did argue basically, that political fideism has become the sort of like new tenet of evangelicalism along some of the other ones that were previously established. I think it's Babington's quadrangle. I forget whose quadrangle, but like the crucicentrism, biblicism, like all those. The new one for American Christianity is political fideism. That being political allegiance to the Republican Party has become as much a part of being a good evangelical at this point. So, which was very borne out when I returned to the States, because when I came back to the States, it was the middle of the Trump campaign, and I was like, surely not. No, it turns out that accelerated my deconstruction. I was like, I'm gonna make this work. I'm back. I'm gonna find a way to be a progressive evangelical. That torpedoed that. But anyway, so this was an interesting well, it's a little dry, but the topic is very interesting to me, and this sort of represents all of those books. Actually, similarly, Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, was very formative to me as well. I read this towards the end of my grad school era, but this is talking about constant struggle for how one has authority in a spiritual movement where personal knowledge is supposed to be so central and personal interpretation of the Bible is so central, kind of charting how American evangelical leaders have tried to assert some authority in light of that theological tension. Very interesting. Really enjoyed that. Oh yeah, Without God, Without Creed by James Turner, The Origins of Unbelief in America. This was also very interesting and helpful to sort of why evangelicalism is so allergic to doubt and like the historical roots of that from the rise of modernity. This was like a real game changer. Yeah, I love this book. I should reread this. This was very, very instructive to me. And then Evangelical Identity and Gendered Family Life by Sally K. Gallagher. I picked this as sort of a placeholder for gender theology and history. This talks a lot about how the lived reality of most evangelicals is not nearly as complementarian as what they espouse, but it's the espousal that kind of is like an identity marker rather than the actual adherence to complementarian gender roles, but that like when you go into families, functionally, they're much more egalitarian. So this was very interesting in seeing like the history of why that is, and this was a very interesting book. I wonder if there's an updated version of this one because it's kind of getting old at this point. Okay, so those were some history ones I called out. There's so many others, like Rodney Stark. I did a bunch of research on the church and the Holocaust. So I read a bunch of church history on that. I mean, just generally having to teach church history, that whole process was very foundational to me, but I digress. Okay, so I want to say this one because this was like sort of my capstone. Let's start with some like original source theology stuff. So like from back in the day. Okay, let's say like pre-1950. How about that? Speaking of like gender stuff, Are Women Human by Dorothy L. Sayers. This was the book that convinced me being a feminist was not antithetical to being an evangelical. I have some critiques of it at this point, but this was a very big door opener for me. Letters and Papers from Prison by Bonhoeffer. This definitely has a lot of really the letters specifically are very impactful and have a lot of really good critiques of the God of the gaps and how like in the 20th and 21st centuries, like that ain't gonna cut it. You gotta have something more than that. It's very interesting. The evangelicals definitely have tried to co-opt Bonhoeffer. He was definitely not an evangelical. Anyway, he's actually quite a postmodern theologian. Like I don't know. I've seen some people argue he's like the first postmodern theologian. I'm not sure if that's quite true, but would not say he's evangelical, but he is loved by evangelicals. And if they're gonna love him, I wish they'd actually read him. Oh yeah, Samuel Coleridge. You know him as a poet. He is, but he's also a very interesting theologian. So some of his theology was quite interesting and influential to me. Going back to like the early church fathers, I think is interesting because, again, we have this narrative that the early church was much more uniform than it actually was. For instance, Gregory of Nyssa on the soul and resurrection. When I first read this, I was like, this filthy heathen universalist, bah! Yeah, it turns out that like kind of a more universalist perspective or like less fire and brimstone perspective was very common in the early church. So going back and actually reading the original sources, very interesting and illuminating. I love Julian of Norwich. Revelations of Divine Love. Oh, she's gotta be up there for like a theologian who I can actually get down with it and what she says. She sees a lot of wild stuff, so strap in, but like the hazelnut imagery is amazing. All shall be well and all shall be well and all shall be well. Very impactful to me. Love her. And in a similar sense, in her own words, Women's Writings in the History of Christian Thought by Amy Oden. This is just a source book of early writings from women and like female theologians throughout Christian history. And just that perspective, I think, was very illuminating to me. Some more modern stuff, some of it philosophy, some of it actually theology. Charles Taylor in general is a Catholic philosopher, and his Modern Social Imaginaries and Sources of the Self. Sources of the Self I didn't pull, but like probably one of the most influential books that came out of this time period for me, but Modern Social Imaginaries is shorter and easier to get through. I Am Thou by Martin Buber, who's a Jewish theologian, but just this idea, again, kind of like more postmodern theology or philosophy and conceptualization of humans and God, really impactful to me. For the Life of the World by Alexander Schmemann. He's an Orthodox Church theologian. A lot of that kind of perspective on theology is really what I like it better than a lot of the Catholic and Protestant stuff. So like the conceptualization of how sacrament and a lot of other things work in this was really mind expanding and interesting to me, and like a more promising route to being a progressive evangelical, I think. So that one was very illuminating. Prayer by Hans Urs von Balthasar. This was an absolute mind bender, but he's a Catholic theologian who, yeah, prayer, you can get through it. There's a lot of meat. If you know, you know. Flesh of the Church, Flesh of Christ, at the Source of the Ecclesiology of Communion by J.M.R. Tiard. The reason I pulled this is because I had to write like applying what he's saying to my own church context, and it was the book that made me realize like how anti-Christian it is that like essentially segregation of churches historically, and I understand now it's a little bit different. I get that here in the South, but the idea that there were like separate white and black churches and like the reasoning behind that, this was a real mind opener to me of like the racism in the church. And then Exclusion and Embrace by Miroslav Volf. The subtitle is A Theological Exploration of Identity, Otherness, and Reconciliation. I think if you are a true believing evangelical, I think that this is a really good book to read to try to see a path forward on marginalized identities. Because this is a lot about allowing the other to be other and retaining your own identity. And I found that very impactful, and I will just leave that there for you to consider. We're almost done, I swear. So the two most influential books, I would say, for me from this period, in terms of ones that I've reread since then, still find really enjoyable and challenging. First is Gerard Manley Hopkins' The Major Works, specifically not just his poetry, but his essays and letters and journals, because he's building off of Duns Scotus. He talks a lot about I think it's called the hecacity of things, which is like the thingness of things. So in opposition to sort of a more Platonic tradition. So his poetry is really celebrating specificness of like a tree or a leaf or whatever. And that's where a lot of his theology comes from, is embracing the individuality of creation rather than its conformity to a hierarchy or to like an ideal. For that reason, I did a whole seminar on this, and it was really, really impactful. Also, his poetry is just like beyond. It's so postmodern, even though it's in the 1800s, like it's so ahead of its time. The poetry is great. and the theology is great. This really holds up for me. Like, I want to read some Duns Scotus because of him. Then the other one that I've recommended many times is The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. This is one of my all-time favorite books. And this really, I read this, I think so I had a professor, like my favorite professor, I loved him so much, who gave this to me. He was like, I think you would like this. You should read this, because he knew I was from the South and some of the things it was dealing with. This is talking about Black liberation theology. This was such a pivotal moment in my awakening to God. I don't even know how to get into all of it, but just like everything you think that this was awakening me to, it did. And just the beauty of the metaphors in here about the resonance and identification of Black Americans with Jesus because of the history of lynching in the US and the identification of that with the cross, talking about like the theology of different Black musical traditions. This book was a total reset for me, a total game changer. And also just really expanding my soteriology, which is the theology of how one is saved. This was really challenging and really mind expanding. So for me, this was a real game changer. And then 3 books that I thought I would pull of like, since then, reconstructing. Well, I would say both of these were reconstructive. But then 3 others I thought I would mention. You guys have heard me talk a lot about How Jesus Became God by Bart Ehrman. More as just like a litmus test or like a milestone of where I'm at in my own journey. This book was revelatory in that respect. Part of what happened to me when I was in grad school was that I really actually like very much considered the historical Jesus. So, like when I was in evangelicalism, I'd heard like, oh, the historical Jesus, like that's what they used to like tell you Jesus wasn't real. Not in that sense, like in the sense of what did he actually say, not what Paul said he said, or church leaders, or like what do we have recorded of him in the New Testament and the Gospels. So I think that was a very significant experience, because if you spend more time in the Gospels than in Paul, I think you have a very different perspective on Christianity. This helped me see the trajectory of that time spent in the Gospels versus in Paul, the trajectory of where one can end up if one takes the words and writings and reality of Jesus more seriously than the culturally received ideas about him, which I feel like I say that and then I'm sitting here like, but that's mediated through so many different things. Like I have all these like different caveats running through my head, which anyway, that's a whole other thing. That would be like a 40-minute rant about that. But basically this just like helped me see where starting to take the gospel seriously over Paul, think through that. So there you go. Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Dumez. This, I think, is a really helpful and necessary follow-on to George Morrison's work on fundamentalism, because this is really exploring that fundamentalist evangelicalism. This is really unpacking that, and I think it has a lot of great work from like the 80s through to today, whereas Marsden really kind of stops in the 80s. And then I've Been in Jerusalem. I think that this was a really important, the subtitle is A Report on the Banality of Evil. This was, I think, an important reconstructive thought experiment in theodicy, or the theology of suffering, and seeing Hannah Arendt's kind of more like philosophical take, especially as a Jewish woman who escaped the Nazis multiple times. I think that this was a really important, challenging book for me to think through. So I don't know if anybody cares. Well, I know people care because people ask me about this a lot. I don't know if this is satisfying to anyone or if, who knows. But at least it's here now so I can point people to it. And now that I finished filming this, I'm like, does anyone care about any of this? Should I even post this? I don't know. Insert troll comment here of like, no one cares what you think, you stupid fat woman. I'm sure that will be somewhere in the comments. People asked me about this. It's something that was on my mind. And like I said, apparently I had the spoons today to even contemplate the comment section and the accusation that I was never really a Christian. I guess I'll just end by saying I was all in. Like, I believed it fully. I mean, like when I go back and read my journals from this time, the level of just like self-loathing and self-castigation for not being a good enough Christian, not making God happy, striving and trying to be more loving, but I can see now having such like specific parameters on who and what I could love, trying to be as orthodox as possible, eating up every sermon with a spoon, constantly looking for people who, you know, I could trust to be actually good orthodox sources of truth. Like I was all in, all in, and I'm out. And The reason I'm out is because, who knows, like I think a variety of factors, but I will say, Rhett and Link have done a series of videos about their deconstruction, and there was one video or like clip from Rhett that went viral talking about like your kids are not leaving the church because they don't know what Jesus said. Your kids are leaving the church because they have read the words of Jesus. They look around at the church and are like, WTF, this does not reflect the Jesus that I'm reading about. And I think that's honestly the answer for me. I don't think Jesus was God, but he seemed, based on what we know about him, a lot of the stuff he's saying, I'm still down with. I think seeing the church in America be the way it was at the time of Trump's election, first campaign, killed any chance that I could ever come back and reintegrate myself in that church. Seeing the attitudes and assumptions and hatreds of that church when I tried to come back into it, I think really just like precipitated my exiting from it. And, you know, counterfactual, it's hard to say, but I am happier, wholer, kinder, more empathetic, more loving, and just more myself than I ever was in that system. Who knows, maybe that would be the case even if I was still in. Maybe it's the difference between in her 20s Mara versus in her 30s Mara, who can say. But happy for those who it still works for. Like, I'm not trying to deconvert anyone because I think it's a very personal and very like traumatic experience to go through this level of completely changing what you think you know about the world. It is traumatic, and I would not intentionally try to lure anyone into doing that. Yeah, I just don't think that that would be ethical. But for those who are asking, I thought I would share, and I'm rambling. Hopefully I can edit this into something reasonable. But with all that being said, you know, bracing myself for the comments. Feel free to recommend some books if you want to do that. And yeah, I hope you are happy and well, and that you are becoming a more empathetic and loving person every day. That's all any of us, I feel like, can really try to do. So good luck with that. If you like the video, like it. If you want to hang around, subscribe. I normally do more bookish-based stuff, but you know, we had a lot of books today, and you know, try to mix it up with some commentary every once in a while. So hope you're having a good one. Catch you on the flippity flop.